I'm Allison Eyring, organization psychologist, CEO, and endurance athlete. I've spent the last 25 years helping companies solve the people and organizational challenges of growth. I've worked with all types of CEOs and business leaders across the world, but it takes a special kind of leader to successfully grow a business. I call them growth leaders. These leaders have an edge for growth. This allows them to drive performance today while transforming their business for tomorrow while keeping their people energized. So whether you're starting a company or reigniting a team within a large, mature company, I'll show you what it takes to successfully drive business growth through conversations with some of the best growth leaders I know. In this episode, we'll dive into the topic of digital transformation and leading disruption in a traditional industry. Startup platforms are driving a faster pace of disruption to keep up with consumer expectations for on-demand services. What does this mean for future leaders? I'm going to speak with Arif Zauddin, founder and CEO of Chope, about these ideas. Chope is a platform for restaurant reservations and deals that was co-founded by Arif in Singapore in 2011. It has rapidly expanded across Asia. Welcome, Arif.
Hi. Hi, everyone.
It's great to have you here with me. I am a user of Chope, so it's fun for me to be able to talk with you and learn about the business behind it. So, of course, eating is really our national pastime in Singapore, so yep. I'm sure that it's impossible for us to have a conversation without a little bit of food. But I want to just start by asking you, how did you come up with the idea to start Chope?
Right. Okay. So, like you said, I started Chope a number of years ago in 2011, and it really came out of my own personal experiences as someone who, I eat out a lot. I go out with friends and family, and we go to restaurants a lot. And at that time, I was amazed that you could make almost every other transaction online. You could book airlines and hotels and travel, but you couldn't really do that for restaurants, which was for me, and I think for a lot of people, the most common use case, right? You eat out weekly, if not more often than that, whereas travel is more like an annual thing. So we set out just to figure out why that problem existed, really, and then it just sort of snowballed, right? I think with all startups, you sort of start off with trying to figure out the problem, then you start thinking maybe there's a solution, how can I figure out? And it's not like I started off with a grand vision of I'm going to change the world and here's how I'm going to do it in 15 steps or whatever. It really was just trying to figure out why restaurants weren't adopting technology, etc., etc. So it really just grew out of that and escalated to kind of what it is today.
So in this instance, it was really a pain that you had as a consumer that then translated into the business idea. The name I love, it's so Singaporean. How did you come up with it? Or
Sure.
Your partner? I mean, how was the name chosen?
Yeah,
Chope.
no, it was really interesting because at that time when we were throwing this idea around, I was also coming up with ideas for it. And I was thinking, I was starting to land on the name Eat Seat, which we never ended up using, obviously.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah, and one of my friends who I was bantering with said, that's hard to spell. Is it S-I-T-S-E? Like, what we want is just a short name that's easy to pronounce. How about Chope? Because it means to reserve in Singapore. And it's a colloquial slang. It's not really used by any other website right now. And I said, well, look, someone's bought the URL. I'm sure someone has. So we just quickly, pull out your iPhone. At that time, it was like, iPhone 1. So, half an hour later after you Googled it, the result would come up. And indeed, chope.com.sg was available. And so we said, we better quickly buy it before somebody snaps it up. And then we'll figure out what to do with it next. So I went home and I bought it for, $12 or whatever it was. And, then I had this asset that was, on the balance sheet, so to speak. And then I started thinking, what can I do with it? And again, it was one of those situations where it started to snowball, where I have a website. Okay, let's put a landing page. Okay, let's start counting down to a date. And things just grew from there.
Right. So the original concept was a reservation platform. Is that right?
The problem we were trying to solve originally was the ability to make reservations online accurately, real-time, 24/7 at restaurants. That's correct. But today, of course, the platform has evolved into a much larger use case Basically, today we connect diners and restaurants across Asia, 5,000 restaurants, 7 cities, in a variety of ways, all the way from obviously the original use case of reservations to things like seeing content like menus, opening hours, pictures, to buying deals and promotions at those restaurants, and also solving operational issues at those restaurants like queue administration, marketing technology, CRM, just a whole bunch of different problems that as we got deeper into the F&B industry, we saw more and more applications of technology, more and more opportunities for us to improve things. And so we started expanding organically into those verticals.
In the process of coming up with new product extensions and ways that you've grown, what's typically driven it? Is it somebody comes to you with an idea in the organization, or is it that do you have some mechanism in the organization for identifying new opportunities?
One of the most exciting evolutions that we've had is as a company, how we treat ideas that float up, right? Originally, as a startup, everything was super agile and dynamic. I could wake up in the morning, have an idea, by evening we'd have implemented it or some form of it. Today, obviously, we have a lot more people. We have about 200 people across our cities, and we have to be a lot more structured about these things. So we have loops for providing feedback. We have staff engagement surveys and things. We obviously have managers that talk to the people that report to them, and we hear feedback from the ground all the way up to, you know, the head of our product team, myself, head of our business team. And in our ExCo, which is the sort of the management team, we debate these ideas and we decide which ones to pursue using a framework. So it's a lot more structured today than it was back then. Now, is it better or worse? I couldn't answer that question. I think it's dependent on where in your evolution you are as a company. You don't need frameworks when you're 5 people, right, but you can't also have a loudest voice in the room policy when you are 200 or Correct. 2,000 people. Your
business itself is very high tech, right? And yet you work with an industry that's very traditional, and it's a largely smaller, owned by small business owners. What are some of the things that you're learning about how to create positive change and transformation in smaller, more traditional businesses?
Right. Very good observation, and definitely one of the challenges that we've been learning about and tackling since the very beginning. You're right. The restaurants aren't in a high-tech industry. They're not doing what they do because they want to be advancing technology. They're doing it because they love serving people who come to dine. They love giving people a good time, having them enjoy being around families and friends. And we want to give them more space to do that part which they love and take away stuff that they don't love. I'll give you an example of this, right? So, for example, today, a lot of restaurants have to, call up the people who are coming tonight to check with them if they are indeed turning up. We don't want a no-show because that's lost revenue for the restaurants. And prior to Chope's existence, the most obvious way to do this would be to pick up the phone, call them, and they wouldn't answer. You call again later, and you check, and sometimes you get through. And it was just a huge time sink for a lot of the staff. Today, with the technology, we just make it as easy as you press a button that says reconfirm on our table management system. It sends an automated voice call out to whatever number. You can 50, 100, 5,000 people, doesn't matter, right? It's technology, scalable. So it enables them to do that very quickly. In how long? 30 seconds, right? And then it sends out this automated voice call. And of course, the rule is if no one answers, it tries again in 10 minutes, etc., etc. It just makes it so much easier. And that's not a part of the service or the part of setting up a restaurant that restaurateurs actually enjoy or want to do, right? And so we take these hours off their plate. No pun intended. We give it back to them. Well, then we give it back to them so they can do other things like think about the menus, decor,
I
whatever.
Love that.
Right?
So it's really about helping them be their best at what they most love, and then you're providing the support and the technology around it on the more the business aspect of it.
Exactly. However, it is, of course, correct to say that one of the biggest challenges and resistance that we faced in our growth was having to convince or educate the restaurateurs that this was something that would work for them or be used for them. I think the biggest challenge we face can be phrased as, if it ain't broken, don't fix it, right? In the restaurant industry, well, serving food to other people as a concept has been around since the dawn of mankind, sitting around the fire and all that. And so the idea of changing that industry fundamentally, even if it was just to upgrade your technology on whichever end of the spectrum, was something that, a lot of restaurateurs say, well, it's already working right now, pen and paper. What do I need to change things? What can I really get out of it? And if it was already so good, why haven't, everyone else changed?
Right.
And I think that there were two factors that really swung it in our favor here. The first was we really focused on relationships and making sure that whenever we provided the technology to a restaurant, we really didn't just sell them a technology. We sold them the ability to be there within 15, 20 minutes and hear their feedback. And of course, the first few iterations of our technology, I'll be honest with you, weren't great, right? Just like every other technology company, it was that very first iPhone or it was that very first, typewriter or whatever that, sort of worked, but it wasn't its best.
Yeah, it usually gets better over lots of iterations with customers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it somewhat solved the problem, but it was a minimum viable product, as we say. And of course, what our principle was not just to sell it to them and then run off to the next sale, but really to come back to them almost daily and say, okay, you're having a problem with it. What's the problem? And they would tell us all kinds of stuff. I can share with you that out of the first 10 restaurants or so that we sold, 6 of them immediately, shut the laptop. At that time, there were no iPads. They just shut the laptop and threw it back at us.
So when did you know? So you had people say, nah, you had others say, oh, I hate this, but blah, blah, blah. Like, when did you know it was going to work?
I think different milestones, right? When did we know it was going to work? We knew that there was something that was really working for the restaurants. The first milestone was, of course, as I said, those 3 restaurants coming back and saying, we do use it. It does help with this thing and this thing, but there's a million things you guys need to improve. And they were like, okay, wait, so it does work for you guys. And then when it worked for the diners, that was a different moment. So after a few months of working with the restaurants, we finally opened the gates, right? We launched the website for diners as opposed to just the restaurant side stuff. And I think in the first week, we had something like 14 reservations, right? So it's all my friends, every single name. I was like, oh, this guy, yeah, I know this guy, yeah. We worked together, and that guy's my friend's friend. And then I think there was a moment when I saw the first name that I didn't recognize, and I was like, who is this? Like, what is going on? And that's when it dawned to me that people weren't just doing it because they were friends and trying to be nice, but they were actually getting value out of it.
Coming up in the next segment.
I'd done a variety of stints in different odd jobs, including as a waiter, trained as a lawyer, I'd worked as a consultant.
You're listening to Growth Leaders, a podcast with Alison Eyring.
So I do have to ask you, because when you started Chope, you were 29.
Yeah.
You didn't have a lot of experience. Maybe you'd eaten in a lot of restaurants, but you really didn't have a lot of experience. What did you know, or what were you able to do that you think really made a difference in being able to have a business that has survived and grown quite successfully?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I love that talk by Steve Jobs at Stanford about connecting the dots backwards. And sadly, the year that we started shortly after that was actually when Steve Jobs actually passed away. And so we ended up listening to that speech quite a bit. And it's so relevant to my own story, because in my past, prior to starting Chope, I had trained as a lawyer. I went to law school. I'd worked as a consultant at a management consulting firm based here in Singapore, but also headquartered in the US. And I'd done a variety of stints in different odd jobs, including as a waiter. So by the time
haven't we all?
Yeah, well, you'd be surprised. I don't know about today's millennials. Maybe not. Maybe not. More likely to be an influencer than a waiter, I would say. And sort of when I started the company, looking backwards, none of those things were immediately relevant. But in combination over the years that I've been at this, all those skills have come into play. For example, with every contract that I review or write, those lawyer skills suddenly kick in, right? The first versions of our sales agreements I drafted because, we didn't have a lawyer, right?
It's a helpful skill.
And it was all relevant at the time. And then things like my exposure to different cultures and countries across Southeast Asia, which happened as a management consultant. When we were starting a business, for example, in Thailand, I'd worked there for a year in my role as a management consultant in a totally different industry, of course. But I already had some ground knowledge of different cultural, differences, marketing channels. I had a group of people there that I knew. So all these things sort of connected and gave me a bit of experience. Of course, nothing really prepared me for the startup journey, right? You can never really be prepared for that until you've done it. But I think I was fortunate to have a lot of experience under my belt that I was able to share to even today with the team that I work with. You know, we all bring the equivalent of our own dots, right? And we collect them together. And that makes us so much stronger a team than people who've just been in the tech or startup industry solely.
Right. Now, you said nothing could actually ever prepare you for it. And as you've been on the journey, the startup journey, what do you think has been the greatest challenge for you as a growth leader?
Right. So challenges have come in different forms. And the three main ones that come to mind are, firstly, dealing with restaurants. We've already covered that, right? Mm-hmm. Changing an entire industry is a difficult feat to undertake. The second one is around the organization, building up a team that goes from being passionate, doing it for love, to a professional organization. And we've covered that a little bit in how innovation happened at Chope versus today. Mm-hmm. And I guess the third one is around fundraising. The Southeast Asian startup ecosystem is still quite young, quite nascent. So not only are we a startup, startups as a whole are in a early stage industry. So there's, compounding risk and unknowns there.
Right. Well, and I think it's also harder because if you're in a place like the United States, the market's so big. It would be like being in China, right? And where the market's so big, common language, generally common government framework. Whereas for your business, you're really moving into completely different countries, different languages, religion, and eating is very different. Now, I want to ask a little bit about that because, eating has to be the most personal thing we do, right? We eat with our friends and our family. So what have you learned as a business leader about this balance that you have, that on one hand, you're a platform, and you're a tech company, but you're also involved in one of the most personal things people do.
Right. I would actually dispute that it's personal because to us, almost the exact opposite is the most social thing people do these days, right? How many times do you actually sit down with someone and say, hey, I want to look you in the eye and I want to do something in close proximity to you? The most common situation is let's have lunch, let's have dinner together. And so I say that eating out together is still one of the most social, one of the last few social activities that people regularly do, coronavirus notwithstanding. So I think that a lot of our mission is around that part of it. And what's common amongst the countries, and it's not just Southeast Asia, what's common amongst the entire world is this behavior of eating out together as a social activity. There's a lot more in common than there is different. You might eat a different cuisine than me. Your bill might come at a higher price or a lower price. But at the end of the day, a lot of the behaviors are very similar. We go to a place where we want to enjoy the ambiance, we want to enjoy the food, we want to enjoy the company. We sit down, we order from a menu, a professional prepares it, brings it to us, we pay at the end with a bill, we stand up, we walk out. That entire journey is so standardized across the entire world, and we sometimes don't even see that how standardized and yet how inefficient that entire journey is, right? We do have to adapt. I think there are certain parts of the company's growth that have required us to stop and think about how do we adapt marketing practices or our team to a certain new country that we're entering. So a great example is when we entered Bangkok, right? So we needed to start the team from scratch. We needed to hire everybody. And of course, we were looking for people that were exactly like our Singapore team. But we quickly realized that actually that wasn't the correct culture to build in Thailand because they have their own cultural norms and the ways they work in the office. And so we needed to adapt some parts of it. Marketing, same thing again. Facebook, sure, everyone in Thailand uses Facebook, but they also use Line, which is not something we use in Singapore. So we needed to get comfortable with new channels for marketing. And just really, really small things like that really needed to be adjusted to each country that we entered.
So it's so interesting to me that you have taken an industry that generally people don't think about as something that you can have a scalable business in, because we tend to think about restaurants being small businesses, and yet you have found the commonality across that has given you opportunities for growth across many different markets.
Right. So there are definitely commonalities and there's a definite scalability to it, which is, I think, best represented in the technology that we build. So if I can step back for a second, Chope's business exists most famously as a reservation platform, and I think many users and hopefully many listeners of this podcast have downloaded the Chope app and used it to make a reservation or seen a restaurant on it. What many people don't realize is that on the other end of that process, when you make a reservation, when you buy a deal or something, it has to go somewhere to the restaurant, right? And what exists at the other end of that telephone line, quote unquote, is a table management system that we've built for the restaurants. Now, actually, 70% of our tech and engineering effort actually goes into that system, not the app that the users look at, but the system that exists on the restaurant side, because it does so many different things for the restaurant, and restaurants are all slightly different from each other, as we just spoke about, right? So while there is a huge common foundation for restaurants, if you ask a restaurateur, they will tell you, oh, my restaurant is totally different from everybody else's, right?
Yeah.
Oh, nobody operates the same way I do. My operations are so unique. And there's some truth to that. So there's some customization that is inevitably required. But of course, the correct way to do that then is to build a system that allows the user, or the restaurant in this case, to customize the technology to their needs, right? So we had to build it flexible enough that the customization could be done by the restaurant on the fly, but also understand that the common bits that connect all restaurants enable us to sell the same technology to thousands of restaurants which literally use our technology today.
And it's so such a great example also of now you're really touching the whole ecosystem, because then, for instance, you can connect with vendors into the restaurants and for their suppliers. You're reminding me of an interview once I heard of the founders of Airbnb, and the leader said that in order to scale, you had to start with what was unscalable. And he shared the experience of going around in New York City taking photographs of people that were on their platform. And so I think that really getting inside the restaurant, understanding the mechanics of it, understanding how they're different, and then figuring out a way to allow them to customize is really cool.
Coming up in the next segment.
Certainly a stigma attached to failure, but actually in a way, it is better for you to fail fast, because then you know the idea doesn't work and you move on to the next thing.
You're listening to Growth Leaders, a podcast with Alison Eyring.
So, RF, tell me a little bit about the future. Where do you see Chope heading?
Right. So I think we've already done a lot of great stuff around connecting diners and restaurants, and we saw opportunities to do that in different ways. So, for example, today we have 5,000 restaurants that use Chope for reservations, but they could also use Chope for other parts of their operations, right? Everything from ordering, payment, and all these technologies are in their infancy. So we see ourselves as providing the technology to restaurants, and we see so much need in such a huge market for it. There are literally hundreds of thousands of restaurants across Southeast Asia. I think the second area that we see growth is in the mass market. So obviously we are very successful in mature markets like Singapore and Hong Kong, and Indonesia to a certain extent within Jakarta. But then there are sort of second tier cities within Indonesia that people don't generally think about, right? But these are huge cities as well. Surabaya, Bandung, Medan, for example. And we see that these mass consumer markets are really maturing quickly as well. And so the need for technology actually is starting to grow tremendously there. So we're also starting to think about how to scale up. And we can't just go back to having a salesperson serve 5-10 restaurants in every city. It's got to be much more scalable. So will these people be signing up for these services on their phones, etc.? So we're really envisioning a service which can serve hundreds of thousands of restaurants across Asia, not just thousands.
I think that's so interesting. And one of the things that's so exciting to me about your business model is that you just have so much data about what works, what doesn't work, when do people show up, how often do people not show up. And so I just see a whole future in helping restaurants be successful. And the failure rate of restaurants is so high. And so it's really an industry where people go into it because they love it. And so if they're able to have help that can help them survive, to me, that's awesome.
Exactly right. The other end of the marketplace is around diners. And you're right, we have so much data about diners that we've only started to unpack. So for example, personalization of the recommendations. There's so much that we intend to do here to make the experience much more personalized to you, knowing that you are the kind of person who likes X type of cuisine at Y time of day. Recommendations to you by weekend might be different than a weekday recommendation. And that's only still the tip of the iceberg. As you go deeper and deeper, you start to realize that this data is also valuable to third parties, right? Payment modes, will they be needing to book a taxi to get to this place? Are they the kind of person who might buy these groceries? All that data can be used in an ecosystem that is much wider than just Chope's. Now, we're not the kind of company that would sell data, right? So we take it very seriously, but obviously there is a way that we can connect all these dots to make it more useful for the diner. At the end of the day, it's about what's useful for the diner to get the best recommendations.
What would be your one piece of advice that you would give to other people who want to become an entrepreneur? Run!
No. I think, honestly, it's not for everyone. I think the one piece of advice I would give is don't be seduced by the survivor bias, which is a fancy way of saying fake news, right? Oftentimes, you'll open your Facebook feed or your LinkedIn feed, and you'll see stories about Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, or back in my day, it was Steve Jobs and Jack Ma. And you'll think, I want to be like them, which is great. Everyone needs heroes.
Who doesn't?
But you don't really internalize how many people aren't Elon Musk.
Exactly.
Right? You don't realize that your journey will have to involve the risk, the very, very, very high risk that you won't become the next, Musk or Jack Ma or whoever. So I would say be very pragmatic about your approach. If this is a lifestyle that you are willing to take, knowing the risks, and still want to pursue it because you believe that it is the right thing for you, the right career. At the end of the day, being a startup CEO is a career. It's just like any other career almost. You can be a doctor, you can be an electrician, you can be a startup CEO. It doesn't make it better or worse. It doesn't make it more glamorous or less glamorous. If it's the right career for you, then by all means, please embark on that. But don't embark on it thinking that you're going to be the best startup CEO in the world. A huge amount of that is down to luck, outside your control. So be pragmatic is my advice.
Yeah, that is great advice. I mean, I think a very small percent even make it, of all businesses, make it past 3 years even. So it's much easier to be to see the successes and think, it must be easy. It's glamorous.
Well, if I can just add to that, I think there's certainly a stigma attached to failure, but actually in a way it is better for you to fail fast, because then the idea doesn't work and you move on to the next thing.
Exactly.
And in the medium term, that actually benefits you, because then you're moving to the next idea, which might be a big success. What is, I think, a little bit more dangerous if you're caught in that sort of middle bucket of companies that are doing okay, and you're starting to not be clear where you're going, and yet you're also afraid of the stigma of failure, so you don't want to give up. And I think that is, I've seen many companies sort of go through that journey where they're not sure what to do at this point. They're doing okay, they don't give up, and they sort of become medium-ish business, and that's okay. I'm not sure if it fulfills the vision that you originally set out with. But suddenly you have to come to terms with that.
Right. Well, it's been great talking to you. Great advice for entrepreneurial wannabes and wonderful lessons learned from your experience. So thank you so much for sharing it with us, Arif.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to Growth Leaders wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment and a rating. We'd love to hear what you think. If you have questions about growth or growth leadership, please email us at growthleaders@organizationsolutions.com. Growth Leaders is produced by Organization Solutions in partnership with MediaCorp. Many thanks to Dee Kirk, Sean Young, Barry Toe, Keith Tan, Zach Rasley, and Susan Eyring.